All right, hi guys, we're going to get started. So today's webinar, we are going to talk about copy constructors. So Lindsay, have you learned about copy constructors in class yet? No? Okay, so you don't know what a copy constructor is. Okay, so basically, but you know what a basic constructor is, right? Like if you have an object, you need a constructor method in order to create that object. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So today we're going to learn about a copy constructor, which is a specific type of constructor for your class where you basically use it to create a copy of another object that is already in existence. So I'm going to try to draw it out visually for you to try to represent it. So let's say that we had a person class. And so we create a person object. So I'm just going to create like a square to like represent instantiating a person object. And we'll just call it P1. And let's say that every person has, they have an age and they have a name. And so those are just like their the two variables that this class has. So let's say that we instantiate P1 to have an age equal to 10 and name equal to Sarah. So we have this person, right, who we instantiated using like a normal constructor, but let's say that we wanted to create a copy of this person. So if you were just to say in Java, so we have our person P1, and then let's say we just created another person P3, and let's say that in Java, you just said that P1 equals P3, because that would make sense. If you want to create a copy of that person, then you just set them equal to the other person. The problem with this is that what the equal sign does in Java when dealing in objects is that it's going to make P3 point to P1. So the issue with this is now P1 and P3 are going to have all of the same information. So then that will make P3's age point to P1's age, and it will make P3's name point to P1's age. But then the issue with that is that let's say that we go and we delete P1, we set it to null, or let's say that we change P1's age to be equal to 12. Whenever we change something about P1, that will also change for P3. So this is an issue because we want P3 to have all the same values as P1, but we don't want it to actually be the exact same reference. So you can fix this by using something called a copy constructor. And what a copy constructor does is instead of setting P3 to reference P1, it's just going to copy over all of the instance variables from P1. So P3 will have an age and a name that is equal to P1's, but it's not going to point to it. So if we change P1's name or age, it's not going to affect P3's name or age. So that is just conceptually what a copy constructor does. And now I'm going to show you some code for it so you can see how it actually works in Java. Can you see my screen? Yes? Okay, cool. So here I have a class called cat. So cat is going to have, each cat is going to have a name, an age, a fur color, and an eye color. And so here is our basic constructor, which is probably what you are used to seeing. And so we have declared that in our constructor, so whenever we instantiate a new cat, we are going to pass in what its name is going to be, what its fur color is going to be, what its eye color is going to be, and we're just going to set the age of the cat equal to 0 when we create it. But we also are going to include another constructor, and this is our copy constructor. And the difference between this regular constructor and the copy constructor is that you can see here, we're not passing in values that we are going to make our instance variables. Instead, we are passing in another cat. So what's going to happen is we're going to take this other cat that we're passing in, and we're going to make all of this new cat's instance variables equal to this other cat's instance variables. So you can see that we're setting this.age, this.name, this.fur, and this.eyes equal to the other cat's instance variables. Does that make sense? Okay, and have you learned about using the keyword this yet in class? Yes? Okay, cool. So we're just setting all of this new cat's instance variables equal to this other cat's. And that's pretty much it. So just to test this, let's say that we create a cat here named Harry. And so I'm setting Harry's name equal to Harry. He's going to have brown fur and green eyes. Now, let's see what happens if we have a new cat called, let's call this cat Tom. And we are going to set Tom equal to a new cat. And we are going to pass in Harry. And then let's print out Tom. Just going to change all of this. And then let's get Tom's eyes and Tom's name. Okay, so now if we run this, you can see here we have our result on the right side. From our copy constructor, creating Tom, and then printing all this information out, we're going to get the exact same information as we would for the cat Harry. But now let's say that we create another cat. We can call it cat, what's another cat name? Tabby equals, but let's set Tabby equal to Harry. Okay. So now, let's say that we want to change Tom and Tabby's name. Let's say we want to make their name their actual name.
Wait, excuse me?
Mm-hmm.
What does this mean? I still don't know what that is.
Oh, sorry, I thought you had answered yes. Okay, so basically whenever you have the keyword this, that is referring to the current object that you are in. So, for example, it's basically a formality. You don't actually need to use the keyword. Like I could have just wrote age equals other dot age, name equals other dot get name. And Java would know that we're talking about this like new cat that we're creating. But this is just kind of like a formality that you're telling Java that you want to find the instance variable for this exact object. So you could do the same thing, like let's say we wanted to call like the getAge method within this class. You could say this.getAge, or you could say getAge, and they do the exact same thing. It's just kind of like a little formality that you're like declaring like for certain that this is the object that you are on, but you don't really need to do it. It's not necessary. It's just kind of good programming practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have the chat open right now since I'm sharing my screen, so feel free to just shout out if you have questions. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's go back to the bottom. Okay, so let's say that we want to change Harry's name, Harry.setName, and let's say that we change it to be, we can just change it to my name. Let's say that we set it to be Hannah. And then now let's print out Harry dot Harry dot get name, and let's print out Tom dot get name and Tabby dot get name. Okay, so now if we run this, oh, cannot find symbol. Oh, change name. Okay, so now you can see that if we run this, we still have, which I know I made this a little bit confusing, we still have the cat Tom's name to be Harry, but you can see that when we changed Harry's name to be Hannah, that also changed Tabby's name to be Hannah instead of Harry, because this equal sign is setting Tabby to also reference the object that represents Harry. And so whenever we change something about Harry, something about Tabby is going to change, and then the other way around. And so that is why you use copy constructors if you want to create like a carbon copy of an object, but you don't want them to represent the exact same thing. And so this is just the example of the copy constructor for this specific class. But if we wanted to, you can really customize it however you want. We could have just set their ages to be equal. We could have just set their names to be equals. It's really whatever you decide makes two objects copies of each other. The main thing to remember is that the way that you get a copy of another object is you always pass in another one of those objects. So here we're passing in cat other. If we were to use the person class that I was talking about earlier, then you would pass in a person other. It could be a person P1. It doesn't matter. You just have to pass in another reference of the class that you are trying to create a copy of. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So that is it for the lesson today. So now Sebin's going to take you through some practice questions. Doesn't look like Sebin has her mic on, but I can send you the link to the practice questions so you can get started on them. Give me a second.
Here, hold on. I can send you the link. There you go. Just let me know when you're done, Lindsay. Okay, that's fine. I can go over all the answers with you. Let me share my screen real quick. I'm done. Sorry, I'm just like pulling up my clips. Okay. So I don't think I can share this screen. Let me just. Can you see this? Okay. So for number one, the question was, what is the output of this one? So I'll just go over this rectangle class with you real quick. So this rectangle has a length and a width, a rectangle object, and then it has a regular constructor where you can pass in the length and the width, and then it'll initialize rectangle. And then it also has a copy constructor where you can pass in the actual rectangle object, and then it'll copy the passed in rectangle to the current object. And then lastly, it has the area method where it returns the area of a rectangle. So any questions up to this point? Okay. All right. So if we look at the main class right here, first we create our first rectangle with length 5 and width 6. Then we create so when we call this line, it'll call, if it'll call our first constructor or second constructor? Good, because we're passing in 2 integers, so the program will automatically call this constructor. So first we initialize our rectangle to 5 and 6, then we create a second rectangle, and then we pass in the first rectangle here. So we're actually passing in a rectangle object. So in this case, the program or Java will call this copy constructor because we're passing in a rectangle object. So yeah, I don't think I had this in the question. So the first, when we run this line, let me just run this line for you. So this is actually our output, and so you got both of the answers correctly because you said both 30. So when you look at this one, the first one is obviously 30 because all you do is 5 times 6, length times width. And the second one is also 30 because when you pass in the first rectangle to our copy constructor right here, first it'll print out this line, copy constructor invoked. So that line is written right here, and that one is actually printed out when we call or when we run this line right here. And then after that, it'll assign the length and the width of the first rectangle to the current object, which is the second rectangle. So when you come back to the main and you print out these two statements, you would get both 30 for the area of the rectangle. Any questions up to this point? Okay, which were the questions that you weren't too sure about? It's probably like number 2. And then maybe another one. Okay. So I don't think Hannah went over this one. But basically, when you look at the copy constructor for number 2, this one, this is like the correct answer, but there's also another way, like more simpler way to change this one, and it is basically you have this word out here, and then you just put in other dot length and comma and other dot width. So essentially, this line right here is doing the exact same thing as these 2 lines up here. It's just like a different like syntax, and it's just like faster to write, it's shorter to write, but like on the exams or like in other classes or when you're doing projects, like these 2 lines are just as fine. But this is just like a good line to know. Does that make sense? So when I comment out this one, okay, so when I comment out this one and then I run it, I get the same thing. Okay. I'll just go over both 3 and 4 with you. Let me check what number 3 was. Okay. So this one, number 3, let me just check what you said. Okay, so you're correct, as in there is no output for number 3, but this is actually a compiler error. Do you know why? There's an error in this code. Do you think you'll figure it out? Okay, let me explain it to you then. So basically, we have a new class called complex. So this is basically like a complex number object. It has the instance variables re and im, which stands for the real number and imaginary number. And basically, if you look at this code right here, it only has one constructor, like our regular initializer constructor, where you get a real number and an imaginary number, and then you just set it equal to the current object. And then we never created a copy constructor for this. So if you look at main right here, when you call the first line, it works because you're creating a complex object and you're passing in 10 and 15. So the real number gets set to 10 and then the imaginary number gets set to 15. But when you call our second line right here for C2, we are right here, this word keyword new invokes the constructor. But when you look at this part right here, we're passing in an object instead of 2 doubles. So what Java does is it'll look in the class complex, and then it'll look for a constructor where the parameter takes in just like the complex object and not doubles. But because we never created that constructor, this one actually gives like a compiler error. Does that make sense? Okay, good. And then I will just go over the last one. So this is the same class, but now we actually have a copy constructor right here. And then you don't really need to worry about this toString method. So the question is are the lines C2 equals new complex C1 and complex C3 equals C2 doing the same thing? And the answer is no. Because if you look at C2 right here, you're actually going into the constructor and you're creating a new object, and then you're setting them equal to the object that was passed in. So you actually have like a new instance, and then you are just populating that with, or literally copying the values from C1 to C2. So now you have C1 and C2. But if you look at the third line, complex C3 equals C2, what this is doing is literally, I wish I could draw on this, but what this is doing is, let me see if I can find a marker. Okay, so let me show you this board right here. Okay, so if we look at the second line, it has complex C2 equals new complex, and then you pass in C1. Does this come out backwards to you? Or can you read it? Okay. So basically what this does is currently you have like a C1 object where you have your real number and imaginary number set to 10 and 15. Now, when you call the second line, you are actually creating another object called C2, and then you are setting it equal to the same values as C1. But when you call the third line, which just has complex C3 equals C2, what this is doing is basically you're just creating a variable C3 or object C3, and you're just basically pointing this to this object. And I think Hannah went over this earlier, so there are like issues when you get rid of this one, like this doesn't really point to anything. So that's the difference between the second line and the third line. So those two lines are not doing the same thing. Does that make sense? Or do you have like any other questions on it? All right, so this is basically all we have prepared for today. If you have any other questions relating to not just copy constructors or any other things, we have one-on-one tutoring anytime, and you can sign up to that, and then I'll give you the link to that if you want. You can ask us about anything, like any topics that you guys went over in class, or just like your projects, or if you just want like more practice problems with the AP exams, we can go over those. So let me just give you the link real quick.
Oh no, don't feel bad. We're happy that you came. We're happy to have you whenever.
Yeah, that is totally fine. I mean, we're working to do this, so it's fine. Okay, so if you have any other questions, let us know. Okay. Bye.
All right, bye, Lindsay. Bye, Seven.
Bye.